Good morning. This is 1 in 36, a presentation from Anderson Center for Autism, celebrating their centennial in 2024. 1 in 36 is a weekly show devoted to autism spectrum disorder.
Good morning and welcome to 1 in 36, the weekly talk show on topics related to autism spectrum disorder. I'm your host, Eliza Bozensky, Chief Development Officer at Anderson Center for Autism. And today I have, otherwise known as The Bobbi Show, I have Dr. Bobbi Newman and Bobbi Rogers, both from Proud Moments ABA, but different roles. And they're here to talk about a book and what Proud Moments is all about. So welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you both. Between the two of you, I know you have a wealth of experience, both personal and professional, and a combination of all of that, and have been working together for quite a long time. Can you just take a minute or two and give us a little background on each of you? And Bobbi, with an I, I'll start with you.
Well, thank you for having me. I am a director at Proud Moments. I deal with community and industry relationships. I've been with Proud Moments since 2016. I am the founder of Families for Effective Autism Treatment of Central New York, now referred to as New York Families First. Okay. And I am the proud parent of 3 children. My son, Joey, who is 23, he is autistic. And that is how I got to know Bobbi Newman, is 2 decades ago. I think it's been like so long. When I started our nonprofit, our first grant program was a crisis intervention grant. And that's part of what really brings me to this conversation today, is just getting to know the families that have been in that grant program for the last 2 decades. He has always been my go-to person. And a lot of what was in the book were near and dear to my heart as I watched a lot of our families dealing with big stuff, try to navigate those journeys. So I was really grateful when he decided to go ahead and dive in and really take this on a couple of years ago.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. And Bobbi Newman, otherwise known as Dr. Bobbi Newman, otherwise known as, I think, the Dark Overlord of ABA, if you look for his email address. I know personally from having met you when you came and did a couple of trainings at Anderson that you have one of those very calming, sort of reassuring personalities, even when you're dealing with really sort of big stuff, as Bobbi with an I just said. So Bobbi with a Y, could you tell us a little bit more about your background and what brought you to work on this book and this project with Bobbi?
Certainly. I began my career as a teenager doing direct care sort of work at a local place in Rockaway Beach, New York, where I'm from. Yes, for you Ramones fans, there really is a Rockaway Beach. Shortly thereafter, when I was in graduate school, I began work with the New York City Crime Victims Board, which meant that I was working within precincts within New York City, primarily the 107th, 109th, and 111th. And because of my dual background, working with people with developmental disabilities and being very involved with some of law enforcement type stuff, I became very friendly with a lot of officers. And although I don't do the crime victims work like I did earlier in my career, and again, remember 40 years ago, I've continued to keep my relationships, and I still do trainings for first responders, police, fire, EMTs, whoever. The work has taken me all over the world, autism spectrum disorder and applied behavior analysis work in general, and again, to some degree, at some portion of the work I do, the first responder trainings. We've been doing a lot more of this of late. And just to engage in some literary foreshadowing, we have some materials like Bobbi has put together, decals for homes and cars that alert people when there's a person diagnosed with autism in the home or the car to avert possible tragedy. Some anti-elopement kits that I'll make reference to, or that she'll make reference to over the course of time. But really, we've been just trying to help to spread information about the autism spectrum. I had decided to write the book, which to my everlasting regret, I did not think to ask Bobbi to be a co-author on. I certainly should. She's as responsible for what's in the book as I am. But irony, fate, I don't know what it is. The day I began writing the book, a teenager diagnosed on the autism spectrum was shot and killed by police responding to the home. The young man had a gardening hoe in his hand that they described as a bladed weapon. The family insisted it was entirely dull. There were all sorts of flags, if you will. The police had been to the home 24 times in the last couple of years, and it was certainly an avertible tragedy. And there have been a number of avertible tragedies And so we decided, you know what, we're really going to try to help. And it's not just us, there's a lot of people out there doing this work also, but really just trying to get that information out. We were very gratified a month or two back. Bobbi and I were asked to go to Buffalo and speak to the convention of the New York City police chiefs, just trying to get that information out there. So that's what we've been doing.
Excellent. Thank you so much for the background. And yes, we're going to be talking today. And when you read the book, as everybody, in my opinion, really should, you're going to read some stories that are distressing and disturbing and heart-wrenching. In most, I think, because they're tragic, but also because so many of them are, as you say, in hindsight, avertible. So let's get into the book. Let me just introduce the name of it is First Responders and People Diagnosed on the Autism Spectrum, What Each Needs to Know About the Other. And I want to start with the title. And then you kind of work that all through the book, which I think is really an excellent approach to it. I've read, books. I've been to trainings. Anderson Consulting and Center Consulting and Training trains first responders in our area. There's a lot of very clear, concise information that makes sense to the general public and first responders and families. But what you've done here is instead of kind of putting it all on one group or the other, all families need to teach their children X, Y, Z. All individuals who are neurodivergent need to know X, Y, Z. All first responders have to be responsible for this. You make it a two-way street, if you will, that it doesn't work. One doesn't work without the other. And I just want to first thank you for doing that, because I think that, it's a really important thing for people to understand that the only way to really be successful is, you say this throughout the book too, is that the training can be excellent, but if it's not put into practice, it means nothing. If it's not remembered and reinforced, it means nothing. But also that really all entities, everybody involved here, including in certain circumstances, a whole community, right? Or a whole business, really need to be aware. So when you were writing the book, I got the impression that was very intentional from day one, that you were going to approach it that way. Is that how it started?
Yes, I definitely wanted to highlight that it was a reciprocal kind of relationship. And I'm very troubled sometimes by, again, trainings are done, but as you said, if they're not effective, forgive me, this is the behavior analyst in me. If the behavior doesn't improve, then it wasn't a reinforcer, right?
Yep.
The treatment plan that doesn't work and isn't able to be carried out with the resources isn't worth the paper it's printed on. So I wanted to be very practical, and practically speaking, unfortunately, too often people are put into very difficult positions. I mentioned one story in the book where I actually got in trouble, so to speak, in terms of beginning a crisis intervention procedure, not realizing that an article of clothing I was wearing, a volunteer firefighter jacket, was going to be triggering to the young man, because when he had trouble, the local fire department was called and 6 or 7 big people would come and lay on him. Now, if anything had ever gone wrong, and thank goodness nothing ever did as far as I know, except that the young man was now terrified of first responders, but we'll leave that for a later discussion. Those people, those firefighters, had never been trained in crisis intervention. They had never been trained in de-escalation. They had never been trained in a variety of things. Asking them to do that, and then maybe our holding them to some standard when they made a mistake, when they'd never been trained, as I say, that's a setup. Asking someone to do something they've never been trained is a complete setup. And similarly, if we don't train people diagnosed on the autism spectrum how to recognize a first responder, recognize that they're the good guys. I hate to say
the helpers. Yep.
Mr. Rogers there, look for the helpers. I still see this all the time where people, well, if you don't stop that, we're going to call the police. No, we want them to be the good guys. We want the police to be people that someone looks to for help, not someone that you run away from or think is going to hurt you, and now you go into fight or flight mode. Virtually every serious, and I say virtually because obviously we don't know all cases, and there were a couple that were just flat out abuse that I described in the book. But most often the difficulties came from somebody not following a simple direction, like to put down something that the police regarded as a weapon, or a situation where the individual had been taught such bad things about first responders that they attacked first with a knife. We have to work on both ends, teaching the people diagnosed on the autism spectrum, this is a first responder, this is how you interact, and this is what we teach first responders. Here's a person diagnosed on the autism spectrum. Here's how you can understand what some of their behavior actually means. And it may not be what you're trained to think.
Right.
in first responder training, that agitation, refusing to take hands out of pockets, talking to yourself. All of these are taught, hey, this is a person who's escalating who may become aggressive. We know them as very common behaviors of people diagnosed on the autism spectrum who are in no way, shape, or form going to become aggressive, but this is how they deal with stress.
Yeah.
Bobbi, can I tag out to you here?
Well, actually, we're almost done with our first half of the show. It goes fast, like I said. So I was going to take a quick break. And when we come back, I was going to also throw it to Bobbi and ask you. So I'll just give you a minute to prepare as we take a quick break, both about the decals, the visuals that have been created, because they're in the book and they're on the book. And I think they're great. As well as, what this means for the perspective of families and caregivers. People, is it filling a gap? Is it addressing the need in the way that families need it to? So when we come back, we're going to hear from you. But thank you for the first half of the show. Very informative. And again, the name of the book, I'm just going to throw it out there so people can find it. First Responders and People Diagnosed on the Autism Spectrum, What Each Needs to Know About the Other. And this is 1 in 36, the weekly talk show on topics related to autism spectrum disorder. I'm your host, Eliza Bozensky, and we'll be right back.
Sometimes I just cannot believe all the storms we've gone through here.
I can only hope that we'll be able to leave this house to you one day, baby. You're our legacy.
Planning for these disasters will make sure we're safe, and is the best way to protect that legacy. You know what? We should make an emergency communication plan. That way we're ready this year. At my dorm, we have emergency kits for earthquakes and wildfires, but I'm sure there's something more local I can send you with a link.
Okay.
Smart.
Protect your legacy. Visit ready.gov/plan for the tools and tips you need to start your emergency preparedness plan today. Brought to you by FEMA and the Ad Council.
Somewhere, there's a river rushing through the woods while someone rushes through their day. There's a mountain looking up at the sky while someone looks down at their phone. A trail waiting to be walked while someone waits for a latte. This world is full of somewheres waiting for someone just like you. So go see yours at 154 national forests and 20 grasslands. And to learn more, visit nationalforest.org. The National Forest Foundation. See your somewhere.
And now, 1 in 36 continues on 100.7 WHUD. This is a weekly community affairs program presented by the Anderson Center for Autism.
Welcome back to 1 in 36, the weekly talk show on topics related to autism spectrum disorder. I'm your host, Eliza Bozensky, and I'm talking today with Dr. Bobbi Newman and Bobbi Rogers from Proud Moments ABA, as well as having just finished a book. And I think for the show, we're just going to give Bobbi credit for being a co-author, even though it's not on the book. But Bobbi Newman was just explaining that really you worked very collaboratively and have for decades, you said, Bobbi with an I, together. So clearly, your voice is heard throughout this really great book. I just want to do a shout out. It is a wonderful book. It is called First Responders and People Diagnosed on the Autism Spectrum, What Each Needs to Know About the Other. And honestly, whether you are a parent, a professional, an individual with autism, a first responder, the family member of a first responder, whatever. I mean, even just somebody who wants to learn a little bit more about ways to avert tragedies that are avoidable. This is a really excellent book. It's an easy read. It's broken down really clearly. It's funny. Bobbi, we all know that you are well known for your sense of humor and bringing it into the stories that you tell, but it helps. It helps us remember the point that you're making. So I appreciate that. And it also tells some real life stories that again, you will not forget once you hear them. So Bobbi with an I, can you tell us, just your, some of the work that you did in working on this book? I know the decals and the visuals are really important. Maybe talk about those and just the family perspective. You're very connected to other families, including yourself. Why is this important?
Well, I think for starters, one of the things that's always struck me is that when you're talking about a crisis situation, and generally speaking, if we're reaching out to first responders, that's what we're talking about.
Mhm.
I considered it, as someone that worked with families who were in crisis, as an honor and a privilege to be working with them in some of their most vulnerable moments. And I've never taken for granted what that means. That means the risk of harm, though, is a little bit higher because they are that vulnerable. One of the things that struck me in the process of Bobbi and I speaking to various first responders is there was a chief of police in Auburn, New York that we spoke with. And he had said, we're not meeting with people in the best 15 minutes of their life. We're meeting them in some of their hardest 15 or so. And so what I loved about the approach that Bobbi came up with was a couple of things. First, as you already pointed out, it's very collaborative. Just asking me to be here and talk about this from the lens of what it feels like to be a family that might have such unsafe behaviors that I've had to reach out and call first responders. And knowing that what you don't want to have happen as a family is to have somebody come in and have the situation be so scary that it doesn't de-escalate. It does the opposite, because the next time you need to call, it's going to be that much harder. And it probably already is hard. People out there, like with Bobbi's book and all the work that he's done, to say, let's get information, not just to say, here's a to-do list. We have all these proactive things like the decals that we have one for the car, we have one for your home that alerts first responders, but to also say, let's write a book and really give examples that speak to what someone is actually thinking in that moment, because you can't know what you're walking into and every situation may be different. So there recipe someone can say that's going to work each time. But if you start dialogue like this book creates, then you can start having people really understand some of the whys and walk in open and trying to preserve the dignity of that family that called and that individual so that they're more likely to call again. That's in the end what we want. We want that family to feel better because they called, not the other way around, because we want them to be safe in the future as well. And I think he did a great job at doing that. And I think, again, just having me here and giving me the opportunity to share in this conversation, to put a lens on what it feels like to be a family, is a testament to how he did get it so right and why he did. It gives me an opportunity to say thank you for having me. I think, it's always a good thing when we add the caregiver and the individual perspective to these conversations.
Absolutely agree 100%. Thank you, Bobbi, for that. When you read the book, because I'm just going to start assuming that everybody listening has either read it or is about to go out and buy it and read it, because it's really an important book. You're going to see some resources at the end, but also the cover. The cover has is basically one of the decals that you created. It looks like a home. It's friendly. It's welcoming. It's not scary. It doesn't have one of those big red lines to it that makes you feel like automatically you've already done something wrong and that needs to be corrected. What is your hope, Bobbi, with an eye, in terms of, seeing these, more and more? Do you want to see these in homes and neighborhoods and cars? Do you want first responders to have a bunch of them to hand out as in their helper role proactively? What's the goal?
The more that we have these out, the more they're disseminated, the better. It just gives that first responder, as they're walking up to a car that they may have pulled over or walking into a house, they can understand what they're seeing a little bit better. So disseminated them to first responders. We've given them directly to individuals that are working with families and to families. And then there's other organizations that have their own as well. We created these with first responders and really tried to think about the colors and the language. But there's some other ones as well. My preference is that the more that we have out there, the better. So certainly the method gets us there is the right method. I think they're really helpful, especially for our first responders. Sometimes they just don't know. And just having that little house next to the door so that when they're walking in, they know someone may act differently. And that's just because there's an intellectual or developmental disability. It isn't because there's anything else going on. It really gives them so much information in one tiny little sticker.
Yeah, I loved it. And I also really appreciated the language that was chosen. I remember this part of the book where you specifically chose language that first responders told you they use and that other first responders will respond to. So many times, again, we all tend to take the approach of what we know best. And it's like, well, everybody talks like this. Well, no, not everybody. everybody talks like this. And so I love that. Bobbi, with a Y, you were going to say something.
I was just going to say exactly that.
Oh, okay.
There was some language that some people, what do you mean he's not communicating effectively? No, we chose words and we spoke to first responders and said, okay, here's the concept we're trying to get across. In 2 or 3 words, what would you have been taught in the academy? What is the common language that's used here? Because again, a behavior treatment plan which doesn't have the necessary resources to carry it out, not worth the paper it's printed on.
Right.
A consequence that's not a reinforcer, not worth the paper it's printed on. So we decided these things need to be effective. And forgive me for being dramatic here, but we are literally dealing with life and death. Yep. Unfortunately, people have been shot and killed because of misinterpretations. There is no time to be cute. There is no time to be overly sensitive. We're preventing tragedy. And if that means language that sometimes, well, we're not going to quibble. This is what it's called. This is what we'll use.
I think that was really important. And again, sometimes can be a wake-up call, I think, for many people working in the field, working with individuals, children, families. We soften language often. I was a former teacher in a past life. There's a lot of that stuff that's sort of adaptable to younger kids, but then as they grow older, it especially when you're living on the autism spectrum, you hang on to that language as if it's a lifeline. It's very concrete for so many people, and it has to stay the same. And if you break that routine, like the young man playing basketball, shooting that number of hoops that he had to make before he could leave, that's not the time. You want to think about this before that moment, that like, oh, right, we need to use language that is early on and consistent throughout. So I love that you went out of your way to do that. Okay, we have only about 3 more minutes left. And Bobbi, Newman, I'm going to throw this one to you. A few years ago, I was interviewing somebody who was a first responder and sort of very organically through a family member, I think, decided to bring some training into his work with his colleagues and started to provide trainings. One of the things we got to in our conversation was when it comes down to it, for a lot of first responders, they are trained repeatedly and to save their own lives and to also do their job safely, to make split-second decisions with very little room for and time for additional thought. It's sort of it's I don't know how they do it. I've never been a first responder, but I can only imagine that is ingrained when you start your training and repeated throughout your entire career. What would you say to somebody who's looking at you saying, this all makes sense to me, but I have to make a split-second decision? What's your response to that person?
It's funny. I've spoken to I don't know how many first responders over the years. No one has ever said that to me, except their spouses, their boyfriends, their girlfriends. Everybody say to me, you're asking him, her to take that extra second and make it them killed. Never the person themselves, interestingly enough, which I think speaks to quality. But I own it, and I say it in the book. I'm never going to Monday morning quarterback. I have been in some of those situations, and I would never Monday morning quarterback. The only thing I can say is before it gets to that point, there's a lot of lead up. There's a lot of information we can gather before that crisis make or break split second. And the more we can know going into that make or break split second, the better off we can be. There's terrible stories. The worker of the kid with the kid who got shot when the police officer misinterpreted the transitional toy train the young man had for a gun. Mm-hmm. But he knew except that one last responder who came and the one who actually fired. That information beforehand and gathering as much so that we can recognize everything before the split second. That's where we have to do the work, not in the split second.
I couldn't agree with you more. It's a great answer. I do agree with you that says a lot for the quality and the integrity of the people who are stepping into this job. They know what they're doing. But I'm glad I asked that because that's a great way to end today's interview. In your book, you stress that tremendously over and over and over again, because what I think the one thing that occurs to me is that split second decision is based on a tremendous amount of information that person already has. So what we're doing here is we're saying, add this information to that information, and then it becomes part of the split-second decision-making, as opposed to something that never would have occurred to me, right? So I love that you've done this. Again, I think everybody should go out and buy a copy of this book. I believe you can find it just about everywhere. Is that true? Or is there a specific place you'd like people to look for it?
No, they should be available everywhere. I mean, everyone's default response these days is Amazon. Available in Kindle or Audible if you prefer that. But yeah, the important thing is getting the information out. And I thank goodness I'm not in the business of selling books as a primary thing. If anybody needs and can afford, just contact me. We'll make sure we hook you up.
Thank you so much. Again, it's first responders and people diagnosed on the autism spectrum, what each needs to know about the other. And Dr. Bobbi Newman and Bobbi Rogers, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. It was really interesting. And I hope that your book makes the kind of impact that you're looking for it to do.
Thank you very much.
This is 1 in 36, the weekly talk show on topics related to autism spectrum disorder. I'm your host, Eliza Bozensky. And remember, Anderson cares.
You've been listening to 1 in 36, a weekly presentation from Anderson Center for Autism, celebrating their centennial in 2024. Join them for another edition of the show next weekend.